again, and welcome to Denton's Tales. Now, there are battles that changed the course of history, often pitting nationalism or religion against each other. The British Empire against Imperial France at Waterloo, National Socialism against Communism at Stalingrad, the Greek democracy against the Persian Empire at Marathon, and here in Ireland, Norse paganism against Christianity at the Battle of Clontarf. Well, no, not really in the latter case. It isn't quite in the same category, while often having been seen that way, because while taught to school children as an epic, history-changing struggle, the equal of those other great battles of world history, well, really, it did little to alter history at all, which would have been much the same with or without it. It wasn't fought for the reason usually given, and it wouldn't really have made very much difference if those who lost the battle had actually won it. Important, yes, but not in the way it's usually seen. So, let us take a look at this rather overrated conflict from more than 1,000 years ago. The Battle of Clontarf is a major event in the history of Ireland, of course, an epic 11th century struggle that forms a considerable part of the overall history of the Viking Age in this country. A struggle that we are frequently told was basically religious rather than a political or social one, that it had pitted Norse paganism against Christianity, the Hammer of Thor against the Cross of Rome, a gigantic battle between the evil, dastardly pagans, oh so evil, and the oh so pure and noble Irish king, who was trying to drive such heathen wickedness out of Erin's Isle once and for all, to save the pure maidens of Ireland from being defiled by those wicked pagans, and the true faith restored across the land. Oh, a stirring, heroic tale, to be sure. And, well, completely wrong, actually. It was actually a struggle between native Difflin Irish, as Dublin was known back then, and Norse settlers, who were not Vikings, plus some genuine Vikings, who were Vikings, and the land-grabbing king of Munster, Brian Boru, that great romanticised figure from Irish history, made out to be hardly less than a saint by generations of school teachers. One would think, according to them, he walked around with a halo glowing over his head. It was quite an interesting thing. And he was also, of course, shown as the heroic leader who drove paganism from the shores of Holy Mother Ireland. Out, ye pagans! Oh, the nobility of it, the wonderful love of faith and virtue, the triumph of good over evil. Sure now, and isn't that a great story to be telling? So it is. Well, wouldn't it fill your heart with pride, or so it would? Except, of course, it's also a great big load of, well, what you might step in if you weren't careful walking around a cowshed like. Yes. But that's the way the battle has been depicted in history books, though that's very far from the actual facts, altered and retold until it bears little actual resemblance to what took place on that day back in the early 11th century. And in this video, I will be talking about the battle itself, how and why it really happened, and some interesting things connected with it that many people may be unaware of. It did not drive out the pagans, not that there really were any pagans to drive out by that time. It did not end Norse control of Difflin. The same Norse king was still ruling Difflin over 2 decades after the battle. So much for being driven out of anywhere. And the subsequent history of Ireland would have been pretty much the same, regardless of the outcome of the battle. The onwards march of history had already been set, and the arrival of the Normans changed Ireland far more than the Battle of Clontarf. Ironically, of course, the Normans were themselves descendants of Vikings who settled in France. Now, the Battle of Clontarf took place on Good Friday, the 23rd of April, in the year 1014 AD, at a place called, well, not surprisingly, I suppose, Clontarf, which in 1014 was an area along the coast of Dublin Bay, some distance from the city to the north. These days, it's one of the inner suburbs. But in those days, it made an excellent landing place for the Viking ships, of the people who really were Vikings. Today it's, as I say, an inner suburb, and one would hardly think that a great battle ever took place there. The battle itself actually spread over a very considerable area, from Clontarf itself out to Howth and a distance inland as well, and was fought between a united force of Norsemen and Dyflin and Leinster Irish, along with Viking reinforcements on one side, and King Brian Boru of Munster and his allies on the other. Generations of Irish schoolchildren learned how the almost saintly King Brian Boru fought at Clontarf to drive the Vikings out of Ireland, giving his life in the process. Oh. And freeing Holy Ireland from the evil pagans. But in the immortal words of John Wayne, the hell he did, pilgrim. For one thing, King Brian would have been hard put to it to find any pagans in Dyflin. Most of the Norse settlers had converted to Christianity by that time, and they were led by the Hiberno-Norse king of Dyflin, Sigurd Olafsson, known as Silkbeard, himself half Irish by birth and a Christian, who later would go on a pilgrimage to Rome in 1028 AD and founded Dublin's Christ Church Cathedral around the same time. King Brian, though he had fought against the Norse in Ireland previously, far from wanting to drive anybody, pagan or otherwise, out of anywhere, simply wanted the kingdom of Dyflin for himself, regardless of who actually owned it at the time. But he has traditionally been seen as the noble king who heroically drove the pagans out of Ireland, thus saving the land of saints and scholars from the evil of dreadful, godless heathens. You know, I always find the godless heathens, I find that bit very amusing, since the heathens had dozens of gods, while the Christians, well, they only had, one. Yes, who were the... Anyway, never mind. The Dyflin Irish sided with the Norse community, as did King Maelmorda of Leinster, reinforced by Vikings under Jarl Sigurd the Stout of Orkney and Jarl Brodir of Man, while Brian had the assistance of two kings from Connaught, among others. When requesting the assistance of Sigurd and Brodir, it is said that Sigurd had promised each of them the throne of Ireland if they were victorious. But he told each one of them that he would be the Ardri na HÉireann, or the High King of Ireland. You know, that would have made for a very interesting situation had they won. Presumably one of the two would have met with an unfortunate and fatal accident, like, tripped while walking along a cliff top, or... Anyway, an important point to bear in mind is that, firstly, the native Irish in Dyflin sided with the Norse. They had no need nor any desire to be saved from anything by King Brian. And the Dyflin Norse were not Vikings. See, that's a common popular error perpetrated in almost every TV show or documentary, how the Vikings in Dublin were defeated at Clontarf. Because, you see, Vikings were only Vikings when ships were involved. Now, the Norse who came down from Orkney and the Isle of Man were Vikings because they came in ships to do something when they got here, which by definition made them Vikings, or Vikingar, as it was in Old Norse. But the Norse living in Dyflin, well, they were simply settlers, townspeople, residents of the city, having nothing to do with going anywhere in ships and doing something when they got there. The term Viking has come quite incorrectly to be used for anyone or anything connected with the peoples of Scandinavia in those days, and anywhere they happened to settle and colonize, be it Britain, Ireland, Iceland, and so on. And even this, yes, the famous or infamous, depending on whether you were in it or watching it approaching, the Viking longship didn't actually exist. What's that you're holding, you might say? Well, it is a ship. But you see, when the ship was anchored in harbour, it was simply a longship. It only became a Viking ship when a group of men, and sometimes women too, got into it and sailed off to raid, trade, settle, or whatever else they might be doing, simply watching the coast going by on a nice day. But even then, it was not a Viking ship. The ship's Vikingness was only that some people were going Viking in it, til fara I Vikingar. The ship was just... Well, it was a ship, and that was that. The term Viking is very misused. Strictly speaking, it applies only to something actually connected with going off in a ship. Sail off in your ship to do whatever it may be, and you are a Viking. Leave the ship and plant some crops and build a house and raise a family. Well, you're no longer a Viking. Your Vikingness was left behind in the ship. So, the two Jarls and their warriors, the only true Vikings to take part in the battle since they did come in ships, landed along the beach at Clontarf at high tide around 5:30 a.m. and they joined up with the local Irish and Norse forces. But before the battle itself commenced, there was one of those two champions fighting each other things, so beloved of combat in those days, with a powerful warrior from each side marching out midway between the opposing armies and seeing who was the better fighter, a sort of mini battle as an opener for the main event. In this case, it was actually a draw since they had killed each other. An old account stating that both died with the sword of each through the heart of the other and the hair of each in the clenched fist of the other. Yes, well, having got that totally pointless macho bit out of the way, the battle commenced. There is a very interesting and often overlooked aspect to the Battle of Clontarf, and that concerns the Viking Raven banner. There's one of them up there on my shelves. And these were used by many Viking leaders, among them the Jarls of Orkney, including the aforementioned Sigurd. And in the Jarl's saga, there is an account of how a Volva, a shamanic seer who practiced the art of sailor magic, made a banner for her son, who happened to be Jarl Sigurd the Stout, ruler of the Northern Isles, comprising both the Orkney and Shetland Islands. And sometime before his participation in the Battle of Clontarf, he was facing an army far larger than his. He was significantly outnumbered, hence his mother's making of the banner, for she had used her magic in the making of it. Oh yes, magic. It was described as being a finely made banner, cleverly embroidered with the figure of a raven, so that when it fluttered in the wind, the raven seemed to be flying ahead. But carrying it was rather a health hazard, since she told him that whoever the banner was carried on behalf of would be victorious. But the poor slob who actually got the job of holding the damn thing was going belly up. She says, "Had I thought you might live forever, I'd have reared you in my wool basket. But lifetimes are shaped by what will be, not by where you are. Now, take this banner. I've made it for you with all the skill I have, and my belief is this: it will bring victory to the man it has carried before, but death to the one who carried it." How nice. Can't quite see anyway. Now the banner does seem to have done everything she expected of it, Sigurd gaining a victory. But the first man who carried the banner was killed, as also were the next two men who took it up. Mother's prophecies seem to be uncomfortably correct. Had there been a request for someone to grab up that banner, I would have taken a few steps backwards very fast. Anyway, in 1014 AD, Jarl Sigurd, bearing his magical banner, sailed to Ireland, along with Jarl Broder of Man, to assist the King of Dyflin, Sigurd Olafsson, against King Brian Boru, the self-styled High King of Ireland, who was trying to take the kingdom of Dyflin for himself. A noble attempt to assist fellow Norse people, along with their Gaelic allies. And a great battle ensued, a battle so fierce that it was said the river Tolka ran red with blood. Sigurd naturally fought beneath his raven banner, and it seemed to be doing its job rather well. He was getting on splendidly. But once again, those who carried it for him began to discover that standard bearer was a terminal position, something that probably hadn't been mentioned at the job interview. "Congratulations, Eric, you got the job of standard bearer. Unfortunately, you will die, but think of the glory of your wonderful heroic death. You will feast with Odin in Valhall till Ragnarok shall come. Oh yes." No, I doubt anyone actually said that. Now, a number of men were killed as they carried the banner. A man would fall bravely, of course, and another would seize the banner and hold it aloft, only to go belly up rather quickly until the banner eventually fell to the ground. The saga of Burnt Njal tells it thus: "Then Earl Sigurd called on Thorstein, the son of Hall of the Side, to bear the banner, and Thorstein was just about to lift the banner, but then Asmund the White said, 'Don't bear the banner, for all they who bear it get their death.' "Half in the red," called out Earl Sigurd. "Bear thou the banner." "Bear thine own devil thyself," answered Harfin. Then the Earl said, "'Tis fittest that the beggar should bear the bag." And with that he took the banner from the staff and put it under his cloak. Not long after that, Asmund the White was killed, even though he hadn't actually touched the banner, but he had, I suppose, sort of insulted it. And Jarl Sigurd, now the bearer of his own banner, was promptly impaled on an enemy spear. Well, your mother had warned him what would happen to those who carried the thing, so when he ran out of volunteer standard bearers, he might have been better off just to stick it in the ground and leave it where it was. In the saga, it says, "There was no man who would bear the raven standard, and the Earl bore it himself and fell there." Well, he should have listened to Mother. Mother knows best. Of course, why she had put a curse on the damn thing in the first place is a bit hard to understand. It didn't make it any better in battle. It didn't increase its magic. In fact, it made it a lot worse because nobody wanted to carry it, which got Jarl Sigurd himself killed in the end. But she did. Thank you very much, Mother. No, perhaps, of course, it was the old idea that magic comes with a price. Nothing is ever free of consequences. And, well, I suppose a spear shoved through one's guts would be highly consequential. The battle began sometime after 5:30 a.m. and it went on till just before 6 p.m., which were the times of the high tide. And that had a considerable effect on it, and was described as extremely fierce, with much slaughter on both sides. The Irish fighting, as they usually did, without armour, and some of the Viking contingent with chainmail. The degree of the casualties evidenced by the fact that only 20 of the men from Dyflin and 100 of those from Connaught survived. Of course, there was the usual exaggeration of great deeds, which one always hears about, such as an incident that occurred near a bridge over the River Tolka, where one of King Brian's sons apparently single-handedly killed 100 of the enemy, half of them with a sword in his left hand, and the other half with a sword in his right, as one does. Towards evening, the Leinster and Dyflin men finally broke, and they began a hasty retreat, the Vikings heading for their ships and the others making for a nearby wood. But here's where the tide comes into it. Quite literally, in this case, it came rather far in. The high tide prevented access to the wood, leaving those heading for it completely cut off. And the Vikings, well, they were unable to make their escape, since the tide had caused their ships to float too far offshore to make it easy to reach them. All right, who forgot to bring the anchor stones? Very good question, actually. And they suffered heavy casualties as a result, some in combat and others drowned trying to reach the floating away ships. King Brian's grandson was actually killed as he tried to pursue them, following them out into the water, but then he was struck by a large wave that swept him back forcefully against a weir, and he drowned. So, King Brian's side won the battle, though he himself and both his son and grandson were killed, as were Maelmorda, Brodir, and of course Sigurd of the Cursed Banner. Despite usually being depicted mounted on a horse, with a cross held aloft in his hand, leading his army, there's a pub actually near where I live with a large painting outside that shows him exactly like that, holding up his cross, riding forth on his white horse, leading the troops, etc., etc. King Brian did not lead the army and die heroically in battle. He himself had actually taken no part in the actual fighting whatever. He was 73 years old after all, and his role in it had been to pray in his tent. Now, whatever his prayers may have done for the battle, they didn't do too much for Brian himself, since Brodir of Man, retreating from the lost battle, came into the tent and killed Brian as he prayed, before being killed himself shortly afterwards, possibly by a man named Ulf the Quarrelsome. I think King Brian really needed better security. What was nobody watching the tent flap? As to King Silkbeard, King Silkbeard, he had wisely stayed in Dublin, holding the garrison in reserve, just in case. Well, that was his story, and I'm sure he stuck to it. And his participation in the actual fighting amounted to watching the various standards waving around in the distance as the battle progressed. The other standards, at least, not killing those who bore them, which, of course, was damn all use to those engaged in the fighting. But it meant that not only did he survive, his holding his men in reserve having paid off rather well from that point of view, but he continued as king of Dyflin on and off up to 1036 AD. The battle has always been seen for some reason as a defining moment, freeing Ireland from foreign rule, though in effect it had very little real influence on that. Oh yes, Norse power was largely broken after that, but their control in the country was already declining. Intermarriage between Norse and Gael and increasing conversion to Christianity, adding considerably to that fact. And the same Hiberno-Norse king continued to rule Dublin for another 22 years after the battle that supposedly drove out the Vikings. So the Norse king was still there, the Norse settlers were still there, nobody had actually been driven out of anywhere, not a great deal had actually changed. So that was the mighty Battle of Clontarf, so often seen as a pivotal moment in history that in actual fact had really very little to do with anything at all. The subsequent history of Ireland would have been much the same had the battle never been fought, or indeed if the Norse and Dyflin Irish had won it. As I said, Norse control in Ireland was already on the decline. Christianity was the dominant religion, and the subsequent history of Ireland and the eventual Norman conquest would probably have been exactly the same, regardless of who had won the battle. And the arrival of the Normans had a far greater effect on Ireland than the Battle of Clontarf. The battle became very romanticized, of course, heavily embellished and overlaid with nationalistic symbolism, turning what had been just one of a number of battles fought between power-hungry leaders over the years into a triumphant victory for Holy Mother Ireland over the invaders. Well, while Jarl Sigurd and Brodir of Man were invaders, I suppose they had come from somewhere else, albeit simply as reinforcements for King Sigurd, the Dyflin Norse were most definitely not invaders. They were a settled, largely Christian community by that time, and had been there for many years, and they were hardly any different from their fellow Irish citizens. It would have been difficult, actually, to tell a Norse person from an Irish person by that time, making the driving out of the invaders, the saving of the land of Erin from the evil pagans idea, really rather meaningless. But it made a good story, of course, and a good story is always more tellable than the actual historical truth. Well, yes, a significant battle, to be sure, but a power struggle between leaders rather than a crusade for Irish freedom, a them or us event, given that, as I pointed out, most of the participants were Irish themselves. Now, this was no battle for liberation from foreign domination, as was the case with the rebellion of 1798, the Fenian Rising, Easter Week in 1916, or the War of Independence from 1919 to 1921, which resulted in the creation of the Irish Free State, which later became the Republic of Ireland as it is today. So, with that, I shall say farewell. I hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next one.